At 11:23 a.m., on the 19th of September 1944, the fog near Arracourt, France, suddenly vanished. Private First Class Walter Kowalsski, crouching inside the turret of an M4A3 Sherman, looked through his periscope and saw every tanker's nightmare. 200 yards away, the sloping glacis plate of a German Panther tank was emerging from the mist. At this range, armor is irrelevant. The Panther's high-velocity 75mm KWK-42 cannon will punch through a Sherman's front armor like a hole punched through paper. The American crew has exactly one advantage. They have already fired. But the shot went wide. Now, the math of survival is brutal. The German turret is already traversing. The German loader is already sliding around into the breach. Walter has roughly 4 seconds to load his own gun before they are vaporized. But there is a catastrophic problem. Walter's tank has been upgunned with the new 76mm M1 cannon. The shells are heavier, but more importantly, they are 14 inches longer than the standard rounds. In the cramped, 7-foot wide turret basket, there is physically no room to load them using the standard army drill, and Walter has a dislocated shoulder. According to the manual, he is already dead. According to physics, he is already dead. To understand how he and his crew survived the next 6 minutes, we have to understand why the U.S. Army sent him into battle with a gun that didn't fit his tank. To understand why Walter Kowalsski was fighting a losing battle against physics, we have to look at the machine that was supposed to save him. The M4A3 Sherman he was riding in wasn't a standard tank, it was a compromise forged in panic. By late 1943, reports from North Africa and Italy had terrified the War Department. The standard American 75mm cannon, the Old Faithful, mounted on thousands of Shermans, was bouncing off the frontal armor of German Tigers and Panthers like hail off a tin roof. The Ordnance Department needed a bigger gun, and they needed it yesterday. Their answer was the 76mm M1 cannon. On paper, it was a masterpiece of ballistics. The long barrel generated enough muzzle velocity to punch through 4 inches of German steel at 1,000 yards. But in their rush to get this killer weapon into the field, the engineers made a critical error in spatial geometry. They took this massive new gun and crammed it into the existing chassis of the standard Sherman. They created a Frankenstein monster. The problem wasn't just the weight of the gun, it was the ammunition. The standard 75mm shell was short, compact, and weighed about 14 pounds. It was like handling a heavy bowling pin. A loader could grab it, flip it, and slam it home with one hand. But the new 76mm anti-tank round, the M62 APC, was a different beast entirely. It wasn't 38 pounds, as the barracks rumors claimed, but it was over 26 pounds of unwieldy steel and explosive. More critically, the cartridge case was nearly 14 inches longer than the old shell. This additional length changed everything inside the fighting compartment. The interior of a Sherman turret is a steel cage defined by the turret ring, a circle exactly 69 inches in diameter. Inside that 5.5-foot circle, you have the massive breech of the main gun, the recoil guard, the radio equipment, the commander, the gunner, and the loader. It is a claustrophobic nightmare of sharp metal edges and hydraulic lines. When the engineers added the long 76mm shells to this confined ecosystem, they broke the school solution. Field Manual 17-67, the Bible of tank gunnery drilled into every recruit at Fort Knox, prescribed a specific loading cadence. It was designed for the short 75mm rounds. The manual stated, "The loader will face the breech. Upon the command, load. He will grasp the round from the ready rack with his right hand near the base, and his left hand supporting the nose. He will pivot on the ball of his left foot, swinging the round in an arc toward the breech." In the old tanks, this pivot and swing worked perfectly. In the new 76mm turrets, it was a disaster. When Walter tried to execute the textbook pivot with the long 76mm shell, the geometry failed him. As he swung the round from the ready rack on the floor, the extra length of the projectile meant the nose of the shell would inevitably smash into the back of the gunner's seat or clip the radio bustle hanging off the turret rear. To avoid hitting the equipment, the loader had to contort his body. He had to pull the heavy shell close to his chest, hug it like a baby to clear the obstacles, and then extend his arms again to push it into the gun. It turned a smooth, one-motion pivot into a clumsy, three-step wrestle. Under combat conditions, this friction was lethal. The standard reload time for a 75mm gun was 4 seconds. For the 76mm crews wrestling with these ergonomics, the average time ballooned to 6, sometimes 8 seconds. In a tank duel, where the enemy shoots every 5 seconds, an 8-second reload is a death sentence. The Ordnance Department knew this. During the design trials for the T-23 turret, the specialized turret housing the new gun test reports noted the cramped conditions and the difficulty of handling the long ammunition. But the invasion of Europe was looming. The Army decided that the lethality of the gun outweighed the misery of the crew. They shipped the tanks, printed the manuals, and left the loaders to figure it out. For a man like Walter Kowalsski, this wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a physical impossibility. Walter was a replacement, a mechanic by trade who had spent his life fixing engines, not loading guns. But more importantly, he was carrying a secret injury. Days before Arracourt, a non-penetrating hit had slammed him against the turret wall, partially dislocating his right shoulder. The school solution required the loader to lift the shell with the right hand and guide it with the left, a motion that relied heavily on the bicep and rotator cuff of the right arm to curl the weight of the shell into the chamber. Every time Walter tried to follow the manual, his shoulder screamed in protest. He lacked the leverage to muscle the long, heavy shell past the gunner's seat, using only his arm strength. So, there he stood in the fog of Arracourt, a mechanic with a bad arm, trapped in a machine designed by men who had never sat in a turret, holding a manual that told him to move in a way that would kill him. The book said he had to pivot. Physics said he didn't have the room. The German Panther staring him down said he didn't have the time. Walter looked at the heavy breech block of the M1 cannon. He looked at the ready rack on the floor. And in that split second of panic, the mechanic's brain took over. He stopped seeing a weapon of war and started seeing a problem of leverage. He realized that the only way to generate the force he needed wasn't to try harder, it was to break the rules completely. That rule breaking began with a switch that every other tank commander in the Third Army kept in the off position. To the right of the gunner station, bolted to the floor, was a silver box the size of a toaster. This was the control unit for the Westinghouse Gyro-Stabilizer. In theory, it was a technological marvel, a hydraulic system connected to a gyroscope that sensed the tank's elevation changes. If the tank dipped into a ditch, the stabilizer automatically elevated the gun to keep it aimed at the target. It was an early, crude version of the Steadicam technology used in Hollywood today. In practice, however, it was despised. The system was finicky, prone to leaking hydraulic fluid that smelled like burnt sugar, and if not calibrated perfectly, it caused the main gun to drift wildly, inducing motion sickness in the gunner. Most crews disconnected it immediately, using the heavy silver box as a footrest or a shelf for storing rations. But Walter Kowalsski wasn't a gunner, he was a mechanic. While other crews saw a broken nuisance, Walter saw a system that just needed tuning. In the days leading up to Arracourt, while the rest of the platoon was welding spare track links to their hulls for armor, Walter had been inside the turret with a wrench and a feeler gauge, bleeding the air bubbles out of the hydraulic lines and tightening the valve springs on the gyro motor. He got the stabilizer working not because he cared about accuracy, but because he cared about rhythm. He realized that if the gun stayed level while the tank thrashed over the French countryside, the breech, the mouth of the gun, would stay in a predictable place relative to the floor. This stability was the anchor point for his new, heretical loading method. Walter turned his back on the manual. Literally. Instead of facing the breech as the regulations demanded, he turned completely around, pressing his back against the curved steel of the turret ring. This stance did two things immediately. First, it braced his body against the violent lurching of the vehicle, turning him from a loose object into a fixed part of the tank's structure. Second, it aligned his good left arm, his dominant hand closest to the ready rack on the floor. Then, he engaged the physics of the moving tank. When a 30-ton Sherman creates a sudden stop or lurches over a hedgerow, inertia throws everything inside forward. The standard loading method fought this inertia. The loader had to struggle to keep his balance while lifting a 26-pound shell. Walter decided to ride the wave. As the tank surged, Walter would reach down with his left hand, bypassing his injured right shoulder entirely, and grip the base of the M62 shell. Instead of lifting it with his bicep, he would explode upward with his legs, using the large muscles of his quads and glutes to pop the shell out of the rack. Then came the hip ram. As the shell rose, Walter didn't try to muscle it into the gun. He kept the shell close to his hip, pivoting his entire torso violently to the right. He used the centrifugal force of his own spin, combined with the tank's forward momentum, to swing the heavy projectile nose first toward the breach. It was a move closer to a discus throw than a military drill. At the apex of the swing, just as the shell lined up with the open chamber, Walter would drop his weight and slam his left hip forward, driving the casing home with the full mass of his body. He wasn't pushing the shell, he was throwing his entire being behind it. The motion eliminated the dead time of the standard method. There was no shuffling of feet, no awkward hugging of the shell to clear the radio. It was one fluid, circular kinetic chain, grip, pop, spin, ram. When he practiced it in the motor pool, the difference was terrifying. The standard book method took 6 seconds of struggling. The inertial pivot took less than 3. But it came with a deadly risk. The breech block of a 76mm M1 gun is semi-automatic. 2 massive extractors sit inside the chamber mouth. When the rim of the shell casing hits them, they trip a spring that slams the heavy steel breech block upward with the force of a guillotine. It happens in a fraction of a second. In the standard method, the loader is facing the gun. He can see the extractors. He can time his release to ensure his fingers are clear before the block snaps shut. In Walter's backward-facing pivot, he was loading by feel. He was trusting his peripheral vision and the rhythm of the swing. If he mistimed the hip ram, or if his hand slipped too far forward on the casing, the breech block wouldn't just close on the shell, it would catch his hand. It would shear off his fingers and crush the bones of his wrist instantly, leaving him bleeding out in a turret filled with high explosives. He was trading safety for speed. He was betting his hand against the 4-second reload time of a German Panther. When his tank commander, Sergeant Miller, first saw Walter practicing the move, spinning like a dancer and slamming rounds into the dummy breech, he didn't see genius. He saw a court-martial. He saw a reckless replacement kid who was going to jam the gun or maim himself the moment the shooting started. "You load that way in combat," Miller had warned, grabbing Walter by his good shoulder, "and you'll lose that arm, and then we all die." But now, in the fog outside Arracourt, with the Panther's turret traversing toward them, the debate was over. The manual was useless. The stabilizer was humming. The tank was moving. And Walter Kowalsski turned his back to the gun, reached for the first shell, and prayed his rhythm was faster than the German gunner's aim. That prayer wasn't just for speed. It was a prayer for forgiveness. Because in the eyes of the United States Army, what Walter was about to do wasn't just a technique, it was a crime. To understand the sheer terror inside that turret, you have to understand the guardrail. Inside every Sherman tank, bolted to the floor around the cannon's breech, was a heavy steel fence called the recoil guard. Its purpose was simple: to keep the tank commander and the loader from being crushed to death. When a 76mm gun fires, the barrel and breech violently recoil backward into the fighting compartment. It travels 18 inches in less than 1/10 of a second, with enough force to shatter a human rib cage or crush a skull against the turret ring. The recoil guard was the line in the sand. Stay behind the fence, and you live. Cross it, and the gun kills you before the enemy does. Walter's inertial pivot required him to violate that space. To get the necessary leverage for his hip throw, he had to lean his upper body over the recoil guard, placing his torso dangerously close to the path of the sliding breech. For Sergeant Miller, the tank commander standing just inches away, watching his new loader practice this move, was like watching a man play Russian roulette with a sledgehammer. Miller wasn't a tyrant, he was a survivor. He had seen what happened when loaders got sloppy. He knew that the Army's regulations Technical Manual 9-1901 weren't written by bureaucrats in Washington. They were written in blood in North Africa and Sicily. The manual explicitly forbade blind loading for a reason. The breech block of the M1 gun was a vertical sliding wedge of hardened steel. When it snapped shut, it didn't just close, it sheared. If Walter's hand slipped on the slick brass casing, or if the tank hit a bump that threw his rhythm off by a fraction of a second, the block would catch his fingers. There would be no surgery, no recovery, just a handless loader bleeding out on the floor of the basket while a German Tiger hunted them down. The tension inside the tank was toxic. A tank crew is a single organism. If one organ fails, the body dies. The driver, blinded inside the hull, relies on the commander. The commander relies on the gunner. And the gunner relies on the loader. If the loader is slow, the gunner can't fire. If the loader is injured, the gun is silent. Walter was already viewed with suspicion. He was the FNG, the fucking new guy. He was a mechanic, not a combat soldier, and he was crippled with a bad shoulder. Now, he was proposing a loading method that looked like an industrial accident waiting to happen. The other crew members, Corporal Red Sterling, the gunner, and T5 Bates, the driver, didn't hide their fear. They called Walter's method the suicide spin. Inside the aluminum, oil-smelling claustrophobia of the Sherman, whispers travel fast. They knew that if Walter jammed the gun in a firefight, they would all burn. "You're gonna chop your damn hand off, Kowalski," Sterling had hissed over the intercom during the approach to Arracourt. "And when you do, I'm gonna shoot you myself so you don't bleed on my traverse gear." This was the reality of the court-martial offense. It wasn't about breaking a rule. It was about breaking the trust of the men locked in the steel box with you. Every time Walter turned his back to the breach, he was telling the crew, "I trust my rhythm more than I trust the Army's safety protocols." The conflict came to a head the night before the battle. In the bivouac area, under the cover of a dripping camouflage net, Miller had cornered Walter. The sergeant didn't quote the manual. He didn't threaten him with the brig. He gave him the dead man's ultimatum. Miller grabbed Walter's left hand, the good one, the one he used to guide the shells, and held it up in the dim light of a red lens flashlight. "You like these fingers?" Miller asked, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "Yes, Sergeant." "Then listen to me. We're crossing the Moselle tomorrow. We're going into Indian country. There are no hospitals where we're going. If you try that spinning trick and you jam my gun, I leave you in the field. If you get hurt, I leave you in the field. You keep that gun fed, or you get out of my tank right now." It was the harshest form of permission possible. Miller was letting him do it, not because he approved, but because he was desperate. The 4th Armored Division was bleeding tanks. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and running on adrenaline. Miller knew that doing it by the book, with a crippled loader, meant a 6-second reload time, and 6 seconds meant death. He was gambling his life and the lives of his crew on the mechanic's muscle memory. Now, as the fog evaporated and the Panther's muzzle brake swung toward them, the time for arguments was over. The ultimatum was active. There was no manual, no safety officer, no court-martial board. There was just the terrifying clarity of the present moment. The system of rejection, the training, the fear, the regulations vanished. All that remained was the physics of the encounter. Walter stood with his back to the gun. The stabilizer hummed its low-frequency whine, keeping the breech level as the tank rocked on its suspension. He could smell the ozone of the radio and the acrid sweat of the gunner. He could feel the vibration of the Ford GAA-58 engine coming through the soles of his boots. He didn't look at Miller. He didn't look at the recoil guard. He focused entirely on the sensation of the tank's movement, waiting for the lurch that would signal the perfect moment to throw the weight. Miller screamed the fire command, his voice cracking over the intercom static. "Target front, tank, fire." The gunner squeezed the solenoid. The 76mm gun roared. The recoil slammed the breech backward, stopping inches from Walter's spine. The casing clattered to the floor, smoking hot. The clock started. The German crew in the Panther was already moving. Walter Kowalski began his spin. That spin was the difference between a funeral and a victory. As Walter pivoted, his left boot dug into the non-slip steel of the basket floor. The Sherman hit a depression in the ground, violently pitching the nose down. In a standard load, this motion would have thrown the shell into the ceiling. But Walter was already moving with the machine. He rode the drop, letting the 26-pound M62 armor-piercing round swing low near his hip. He didn't aim for the breech. He aimed for the rhythm. At the bottom of the tank's lurch, just as the suspension compressed to bounce back up, Walter whipped his hips around. The centrifugal force pulled the long projectile out of its vertical arc and flattened it horizontally. The nose of the shell found the open maw of the gun chamber not by sight, but by pure kinetic alignment. He slammed his left hip forward, driving the casing home. Clack! The metallic snap of the breech block slicing upward was deafening. It missed his fingers by a fraction of an inch. He didn't flinch. He was already twisting his body back to the ready rack before the gun even fired. "Up!" Walter screamed the required signal that the gun was hot. "Fire!" Miller yelled. Boom! The 76mm gun recoiled, spitting the spent brass casing onto the floor. It bounced off Walter's shin. He didn't feel it. He was already grabbing the next round. What happened over the next 360 seconds changed the physics of the engagement. The fog had completely lifted. revealing not just one tank, but a hunter-killer pack of 4 German Panzer IVs and a Stooge 3 assault gun, emerging from the tree line to their right. The Germans had the numbers. They had the position. But they were stationary. German tank doctrine dictated that to fire accurately, the driver must halt the vehicle to stabilize the gun platform. It was a stop-shoot-start rhythm that took 10 to 12 seconds per cycle. Sergeant Miller realized he couldn't win a standing duel. He ordered the driver, Bates, to floor it. "Keep her moving! Flank 'em! Go! Go!" The M4A3 surged forward, its Ford V8 engine screaming as it tore across the muddy pasture at 15 miles per hour. To the Germans, this was suicide. A moving tank couldn't hit anything. It was just a fast target. They were wrong. They didn't know about the mechanic in the turret. Inside the Sherman, the world was a violent blur of noise and hydraulic fluid. The Westinghouse stabilizer was fighting to keep the gun barrel floating level, while the chassis bucked like a rodeo bull. For a loader trying to stand on 2 feet, it was like trying to thread a needle during an earthquake. But Walter wasn't standing. He was bracing. Back against the ring, feet wide, he became the counterweight. Load, spin, ram, clack, up, boom. Load, spin, ram, clack, up, boom. The rhythm accelerated into a flow state. The conscious fear of the breech block vanished, replaced by pure muscle memory. Walter's injured shoulder, pinned against the turret wall, was numb. His left arm was a piston. The school solution reload time was 6 seconds. Walter was feeding the gun every 2.8 seconds. The German crews were baffled. They were taking fire from a tank that was bouncing across a field, yet the shells were coming with the speed of an automatic weapon. The first Panzer IV took a hit in the turret ring before its gunner could even acquire the target. The shell sparked, penetrated, and the enemy tank brewed up instantly. Miller didn't celebrate. Traverse right. Next target, 2 o'clock. Sterling, the gunner, swung the turret. The hydraulic whine pierced the air. He fired. Missed. Load AP. Walter was already moving. He didn't need to be told. He felt the tank turn, adjusted his brace point, and swung the next shell. Clack. Up. The gun fired again. This time, the round struck the Stug 3's lower hull, cracking the transmission final drive. The German assault guns spun out, immobile. But the volume of fire was taking a toll. The turret basket was filling with hot brass casings. The air was thick with white smoke and the bitter taste of cordite. Walter's eyes were stinging, his throat burned, but he didn't break the loop. He was a machine servicing a machine. The remaining German tanks began to panic. They saw their comrades burning and assumed they were facing a platoon, not a single Sherman. They started to reverse, their coordination breaking down. "Don't let him go," Miller screamed. "Pour it on." Walter reached for a shell and slipped. His boot landed on a rolling brass casing. He stumbled forward, his chest hitting the recoil guard. The gun was hot, ready to fire. If he fell forward into the path of the recoil, the breech would crush his ribcage when it slammed back. He threw his left hand out, catching the turret ring, and hauled himself back upright, using the momentum of the recovery to swing the shell into the chamber. Clack. Up. He had lost maybe half a second. It didn't matter. The gun fired. The third Panzer exploded. By the time the driver slowed the tank, the field was silent. 4 pillars of black smoke rose into the autumn sky. The engagement had lasted exactly 6 minutes. Walter Kowalsski had loaded 18 rounds. He had loaded them while moving, while slipping, while terrified. The crew sat in the stunned silence that follows extreme violence. The only sound was the hum of the ventilator fan sucking the smoke out of the turret. Sergeant Miller climbed down from his cupola. He looked at the smoking breech. He looked at the pile of 18 brass casings littering the floor. Then he looked at Walter. Walter was leaning against the turret wall, his uniform soaked through with sweat, his left hand shaking uncontrollably now that the adrenaline was fading. He was waiting for the reprimand. He was waiting for Miller to yell at him for almost dying, for violating the safety protocols, for the reckless spin that could have killed them all. Miller kicked one of the spent casings. He picked it up, feeling the heat still radiating from the brass. He looked at the dead German tanks burning in the distance tanks that should have killed them. 2.8, Miller said quietly. Walter looked up, confused. "Sergeant, I timed you," Miller said, tossing the casing back onto the pile. 2.8 seconds. That's how fast you were loading. He looked Walter in the eye. Don't you ever let me catch you loading by the book again. Sergeant Miller's order to ignore the regulations was a reprieve. But in the hierarchy of the United States Army, a sergeant's permission doesn't protect you from a lieutenant colonel's wrath. And unfortunately for Walter, the noise of their 6-minute war had attracted the attention of the most aggressive tank commander in the European theater. Rolling up the muddy track toward their position was Thunderbolt, the personal M4 Sherman of Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams. Abrams, the commander of the 37th Tank Battalion, was not a man who led from a map tent in the rear. He fought from the front, chewing on a cigar, screaming orders over the radio, and hunting Germans with a ferocity that scared even his own officers. He had been observing the skirmish from a ridgeline 500 yards away, and he had seen something that didn't make sense. He had seen a single Sherman tank maneuvering at high speed, bouncing over broken ground, yet maintaining a rate of fire that sounded like a battery of artillery. When Thunderbolt pulled alongside Miller's tank, the engine noise died, leaving only the ticking of cooling metal. Abrams climbed out of his turret. He didn't look like a refined officer. He looked like a brawler in an oil-stained tanker's jacket. He jumped down onto the hull of Miller's tank and peered into the open hatch, staring directly at the pile of spent brass casings on the basket floor. "Miller," Abrams growled, rolling the unlit cigar from one side of his mouth to the other. "Sir," Miller replied, snapping a salute that looked ridiculous in the cramped cupola. "I counted 18 rounds fired in that engagement," Abrams said. "You were the only tank in the sector. My math says that's impossible. Did your gun jam open?" "No, sir. We hit 4 targets." Abrams narrowed his eyes. He looked past Miller to the loader, Walter Kowalsski, who was trying to look invisible against the radio rack. Abrams knew tank gunnery. He knew the manuals. He knew that a 76mm gun on the move fired once every 8 to 10 seconds if the crew was good. Miller's crew had been firing every 3. "Trooper," Abrams pointed at Walter. "How?" Walter froze. This was it. He was going to admit to violating safety regulation 9 to 1,901 inches front of the battalion commander. He swallowed hard. I turned around, sir. I used the stabilizer and the motion of the tank to throw the rounds in." Abrams didn't scream. He didn't call for the military police. He climbed down into the turret, forcing the crew to squeeze against the walls. The space was impossibly tight with 4 men. Abrams looked at the layout, the long shells, the awkward recoil guard, the bruised shoulder of the mechanic. He looked at the switch for the Westinghouse stabilizer, noting it was flipped to on. "Show me," Abrams ordered. With the tank stationary, Walter couldn't demonstrate the full kinetic effect, but he walked the colonel through the inertial pivot. He showed him the stance, the back brace against the ring, the way he gripped the shell to clear the radio bustle. He explained how he timed the load with the lurch of the suspension. Abrams listened in silence. He was watching the geometry of the movement. He saw that, while it was dangerous, insanely dangerous for a novice, it solved the fundamental flaw of the 76mm turret. It traded safety for volume. For a commander like Abrams, whose entire philosophy was built on violence of action, this wasn't a violation. It was an evolution. Abrams understood that in tank warfare, the safe way usually got you killed. The only true safety was destroying the enemy before they could shoot back. He looked at Miller. "Is he accurate?" "He hasn't missed a load yet, sir, and we haven't stopped moving." Abrams nodded, climbed back out of the turret, and stood on the rear deck. He looked out at the burning German hulks on the horizon. He didn't offer Walter a medal. He didn't offer a commendation. He offered something far more valuable: validation. "Miller," Abrams shouted down, "get on the net. I want the platoon sergeants to see this. If the 76mm is too big for the turret, then we change how we work in the turret. We fight with what works, not what's written down." That afternoon, the inertial pivot began to spread. It didn't travel through official memos or training seminars. It moved through the whispered network of the 37th Tank Battalion. At the nightly coil, where tanks circled up for defense and maintenance, loaders would gather behind the engine decks, smoking cigarettes and demonstrating the move. They called it the Detroit Spin or the Abrams Twist. Veteran loaders showed the new replacements how to brace against the ring, how to tune the stabilizer, and most importantly, how to trust the rhythm of the machine. This informal adoption changed the tactical DNA of the 4th Armored Division. Until this moment, the advantage in a tank duel lay entirely with the Germans. A Panther or Tiger had thick armor and excellent optics. To hit a target, they would stop, stabilize, fire, and move a methodical, deadly waltz. The Americans, with their thinner armor, had to rely on numbers and flanking. But once the inertial pivot, combined with the gyro-stabilizer, became standard practice among the veteran crews, the equation shifted. The Shermans didn't have to stop. They could swarm. Imagine the German perspective. You are sitting in a Tiger, tracking a Sherman, moving at 15 miles per hour across a field. You expect it to stop to fire. It doesn't. It keeps coming, closing the distance, violently bouncing over the terrain. Yet, its gun remains eerily level, locked on your position. And it is firing a 76mm armor-piercing shell every 3 seconds. The psychological impact was devastating. The Americans were no longer hunting in packs because they were weak. They were swarming because they were fast. The mad minute, 60 seconds of overwhelming rapid-fire suppression became the signature of Abrams' battalion. They could put more steel in the air while moving than a German company could while standing still. Walter Kowalsski, the mechanic who just wanted to save his shoulder, had inadvertently unlocked the true potential of the American tank doctrine. He had proven that the Sherman's greatest weapon wasn't its gun or its armor, it was the adaptability of the men inside it. But the Army, being the Army, would never officially rewrite the manual to include a technique that required a soldier to turn his back on a recoiling cannon. The validation would never be written in ink. It would be written in the survival rates of the crews who adopted it. And that survival rate reveals the deeper truth of this story, a truth that most recountings get wrong. If you hear this story told in barracks bars or read it on internet forums, the focus is always on Walter's brute strength. They tell you he was a Superman who muscled a heavy shell against the odds. But that is a comfortable lie. Walter Kowalsski wasn't strong. He was injured. He was exhausted. He was a mechanic. The real secret to the inertial pivot, and the reason it worked when it should have failed, wasn't biological. It was technological. The hero of Arracourt wasn't just the man, it was the misunderstood silver box bolted to the floor of his turret, the Westinghouse Gyro-Stabilizer. To understand why this matters, you have to understand the supreme irony of American tank design in 1944. The U.S. Army had spent millions of dollars classified budget lines buried deep in the War Department to equip the Sherman with a stabilization system that was years ahead of its time. The Germans, for all their vaunted engineering, had nothing like it. A Panther tank's gun was purely mechanical. If the tank hit a bump, the gun pointed at the sky. The American stabilizer used a gyroscope spinning at 12,000 revolutions per minute to sense vertical pitch. It drove a hydraulic pump that instantly adjusted the gun's elevation to counteract the tank's movement. It was brilliant, it was expensive, and it was almost universally hated. Most crews didn't understand it. The maintenance manuals were thick, the calibration was tedious, and if the hydraulic fluid levels were off by even a millimeter, the gun would drift. So, 90% of Sherman crews simply pulled the fuse and fought without it. They took a space-age weapon and turned it into a dumb iron cannon. Walter Kowalsski was the exception. As a mechanic, he didn't fear the complexity of the silver box. He understood that the stabilizer wasn't just about aiming, it was about predictability. This is the technology of grit. The backwards load was only physically possible because the stabilizer kept the breech in a relative floating position while the hull thrashed beneath it. If the gun had been bouncing violently up and down like a standard unstabilized cannon, Walter's blind hip ram would have resulted in the shell smashing into the breech ring, jamming the gun, or crushing his hand. He could turn his back on the gun only because he had tuned the machine to hold still for him. This synthesis of man and machine, a crippled loader using a broken computer to achieve a fire rate that defied physics, represents the defining characteristic of the American war machine. The German philosophy was one of rigid perfection. Build a tank like the Tiger that is mechanically superior, but demands a perfect crew and perfect conditions to operate. If a part broke, the tank was useless. The American philosophy, embodied by men like Walter, was one of messy adaptability. The Sherman was imperfect. The 76mm turret was cramped. The ergonomics were flawed. But the system was flexible enough to allow a private with a wrench and a bad idea to reinvent the way it fought. This improvisation didn't just win the Battle of Arracourt, it influenced the future of armored warfare. When the heavy M26 Pershing tanks began arriving in early 1945, ordnance officers noted that the loader's station had been redesigned to allow for more lateral movement. a tacit admission that the pivot needed space. Decades later, when the M1 Abrams main battle tank was designed in the 1970 seconds, the engineers finally codified what Walter had discovered. In the Abrams, the loader stands to the left of the gun, facing backward relative to the breech, using a knee switch to open the blast doors. The motion grab, spin, ram is remarkably similar to the suicide spin invented in the fog of France. Walter Kowalsski didn't know he was pioneering ergonomic doctrine. He didn't care about the engineering legacy. He was just a man trying to solve a math problem. How do I move 26 pounds of steel 18 inches into a moving target before the Germans kill me? He solved it by ignoring the manual and trusting the machine. He proved that in war, the most dangerous weapon isn't the one with the biggest caliber. It's the one that allows the human being inside to function at the absolute limit of their potential. The book tells you how the tank should work. The mechanic tells you how it does work. And at Arracourt, that difference was the margin between a burning wreck and a victory. That margin of victory didn't buy Walter Kowalsski fame, and it certainly didn't buy him a promotion. It simply bought him a ticket home. When the war in Europe ended in May 1945, the inertial pivot didn't appear in the victory parades. It didn't show up in the official histories written by General Eisenhower's staff. Walter returned to Detroit, to the River Rouge plant, and went back to tightening bolts on the assembly line. He carried the ache in his right shoulder for the rest of his life, a silent reminder of the 18 rounds he threw in 6 minutes near Arracourt. The U.S. Army never awarded him a medal for his innovation. The War Department issues silver stars for charging machine gun nests, not for violating safety regulation 9/1901. There is no citation for creative insubordination. To the bureaucrats in the Pentagon, the technique remained an anomaly, a field expedient solution that officially didn't exist. But the legacy of the mechanic didn't die in that turret. If you look inside a modern M1 Abrams main battle tank today, you will see a loader standing in a remarkably similar stance. While the technology has evolved, digital ballistics, computers, depleted uranium sabot rounds, and turbine engines, the physics of the human body haven't changed. The loader still braces against the tank's motion. They still use the kinetic chain of their legs and hips to drive the round home. They still fight the machine to make it sing. Walter's story is the ultimate proof that the most lethal weapon in history isn't a piece of hardware. It's the mind of the soldier who refuses to accept that the impossible is actually impossible. It reminds us that wars aren't won by the generals who draw arrows on a map. They are won by the scared, exhausted kids who figure out how to reload 2.8 seconds faster than the enemy. Walter mastered the mud of France by breaking the rules, but halfway across the world, another American rebel was stripping the armor off his aircraft to make it fly faster than physics allowed. Join us in the next video as we uncover the story of the 400-knot Ghost, the unauthorized P-38 modification that terrified the Japanese Navy and nearly got a legendary ace court-martialed. If you believe that history is built by the mechanics and not just the masters, hit that like button to help us keep these stories alive. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the truth behind the ghost.